Have you ever woken up one morning, looked in the mirror, and wondered where the hell your life went? You're checking all the boxes society told you to check. Good job? Check. Nice house? Check. Family responsibilities? Check. But deep down, there's this gnawing feeling that something is missing. Something important. Something you. What if I told you that everything you've experienced up until now, all the struggles, all the achievements, all the sleepless nights and stressful days, what if all of that was just the warm-up? What if the real game hasn't even started yet? Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, believed something that might shock you. He believed that life doesn't truly begin until you hit 40. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, great, another midlife crisis speech, hear me out. This isn't about buying a sports car or running away to Bali. This is about something far more profound and life-changing. Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and what he discovered will revolutionize how you think about aging, success, and what it means to truly live. He found that the first 40 years of our lives, they're essentially boot camp. We're learning the rules, playing the game, meeting expectations, and building the foundation. But the real construction, the actual masterpiece of your life, that begins at 40. Think about it for a moment. Every person you admire who made a real impact on the world, most of them didn't hit their stride until their 40s, 50s, or beyond. Colonel Sanders was 62 when he franchised KFC. Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't publish her first Little House book until she was 64. Ray Kroc was 52 when he turned McDonald's into a global empire. But this isn't just about professional success. This is about something much deeper. This is about finally meeting the person you were always meant to be. The person who's been waiting patiently underneath all those layers of expectation, obligation, and fear. The first half of your life is about survival and adaptation. You're figuring out how to exist in this world, how to be accepted, how to be successful by other people's standards. But the second half, that's when the magic happens. That's when you stop living for the approval of others and start living from the truth of who you really are. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming your authentic self. And according to his research and observations, this profound transformation typically begins around age 40. It's not a coincidence. It's not random. It's a natural part of human psychological development that our youth-obsessed culture has completely missed. So if you're approaching 40 or you've already crossed that threshold, or hell, if you're 25 and smart enough to start preparing now, this message is for you. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just theory. It's a roadmap to the most fulfilling, authentic, and powerful phase of your entire existence. The question isn't whether you're ready to get older. The question is, are you ready to finally start living? Because according to Carl Jung and thousands of people who've walked this path before you, life begins at 40. And it's about to get really, really good. Let's talk about the first 40 years of your life. And I want you to be brutally honest with yourself as we go through this, because recognition is the first step toward transformation. From the moment you took your first breath, you've been in training camp. Not training for your own life, training to meet everyone else's expectations. Think about it. Your parents had dreams for you before you could even walk. Society had a checklist ready before you could even talk. And the education system? Well, that was designed to turn you into a productive member of society, not necessarily a fulfilled human being. Elementary school. Sit still, follow directions, don't ask too many questions. Middle school. Fit in, don't stand out too much, but also don't fall behind. High school. Get good grades. Participate in activities that look good on college applications. Start thinking about your future, which really means start thinking about what career will make your parents proud and pay your bills. College. Pick a major that leads to a stable job, network with the right people, get internships that build your resume. And then, the real world. Get a job, any job that pays well. Find someone to marry who checks the right boxes. Buy a house because that's what adults do. Have kids because that's the next step. Climb the corporate ladder because that's success. But here's what nobody tells you during this 40-year marathon of meeting expectations. You can win the entire race and still feel like you've lost everything that matters. I've coached hundreds of people who are successful by every external measure. They have the corner office, the beautiful family, the impressive bank account, the respect of their peers. And they sit across from me with tears in their eyes saying, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I actually want. I feel like I'm living someone else's life. This is what Jung called living behind a persona, a mask we wear to fit into society's expectations. And the persona isn't necessarily bad. It serves a purpose. It helps us navigate social situations, build careers, and function in the world. But the problem comes when we start believing that the mask is who we are. You know what I'm talking about. You've felt it. Maybe you're the successful businessman who secretly wants to write poetry. Maybe you're the devoted mother who dreams of starting her own business. Maybe you're the reliable employee who fantasizes about traveling the world. Maybe you're the practical adult who still has that creative spark buried so deep you barely remember it exists. The first half of life is about accumulation. Accumulating skills, relationships, possessions, achievements, status. We're like busy little squirrels, gathering nuts for winter. And society rewards this behavior. We get promotions, praise, recognition. We feel productive and valuable. But there's a shadow side to this accumulation phase that nobody talks about. With every yes to society's expectations, we're saying no to parts of ourselves. With every step up the ladder someone else built, we're moving further away from the ladder we might have built for ourselves. And the cruel irony? The better you get at playing society's game, the more trapped you become. The higher your salary, the harder it becomes to change careers. The nicer your lifestyle, the more financial obligations you have. The more impressive your title, the more your identity becomes tied to your job. The more people depend on you to be the responsible one, the harder it becomes to explore what you might want for yourself. By your late 30s, many people start experiencing what psychologists call achievement depression. You've achieved everything you were supposed to achieve, and yet you feel empty. You've checked all the boxes, and yet something is missing. You've followed the script perfectly, and yet you feel like you're acting in someone else's play. This is the crisis that often hits people in their late 30s and early 40s. It's not really a midlife crisis in the way our culture portrays it, some silly phase where people act irrationally. It's actually a spiritual emergency. It's your authentic self, which has been patient and quiet for decades, finally demanding to be heard. Jung understood that this crisis isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's supposed to happen. It's the natural result of spending the first half of your life focused outward, and it's the necessary catalyst for spending the second half focused inward. It's your psyche's way of saying, okay, you've learned how to survive and succeed in the world. Now it's time to learn how to be yourself in the world. The tragedy is that most people either ignore this calling or try to medicate it away. They double down on the external pursuits, thinking they just need to achieve more, buy more, do more. Or they numb the discomfort with distractions, addictions, or resignation. They say, this is just how life is. I need to be grateful for what I have and stop being so selfish. But Jung would say that's exactly backwards. The most selfish thing you can do is continue living an inauthentic life. Because when you're not being true to yourself, you can't truly serve others either. You're operating from depletion instead of abundance, from obligation instead of inspiration, from fear instead of love. The first 40 years teach you how to function in the world. But they don't teach you how to be fully alive in the world. They don't teach you how to access your deepest wisdom, your most authentic expression, your greatest potential for joy and contribution. That education begins at 40. And it starts with a simple but revolutionary question: who am I when I'm not trying to be who I think I should be? Something shifts when you hit 40. And I don't just mean your metabolism slowing down or finding your first gray hair. I'm talking about a fundamental shift in your relationship with life itself. It's subtle at first, but if you pay attention, you'll notice it everywhere. You start questioning things you never questioned before. That job you've had for 15 years? Suddenly you find yourself wondering if this is really how you want to spend the next 15 years. Those social obligations that used to feel important, now they feel draining and pointless. Those goals you've been chasing? You start asking yourself if they're even your goals or if you inherited them from someone else. Carl Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are as opposed to who you've been conditioned to be. And he observed that this process typically begins around age 40 for a very specific reason. You've finally accumulated enough life experience to start making sense of it all. Think about it this way. The first 40 years of your life, you're like a student frantically taking notes in a lecture. You're trying to absorb everything, remember everything, perform well on the tests. But around 40, you finally have enough notes to step back and see the bigger picture. You can start connecting dots that were invisible when you were in the middle of accumulating experiences. You've been successful and you've been disappointed. You've been loved and you've been heartbroken. You've achieved goals and realized they didn't fulfill you the way you expected. You've made mistakes and learned from them. You've discovered what energizes you and what drains you. You've figured out what kind of people you want in your life and what kind you want to avoid. This accumulated wisdom creates what Jung called the awakening. It's not a single moment, it's more like a slow sunrise. Gradually, you start seeing your life from a different perspective. You start realizing that many of the things you thought were essential are actually optional. Many of the things you thought were impossible are actually achievable. Many of the things you thought were your fault were actually circumstances beyond your control. And here's where it gets really interesting. Your body starts changing too, but not in the way our youth-obsessed culture focuses on. Yes, you might need reading glasses and your hangovers last longer. But more importantly, your nervous system starts to settle. That constant underlying anxiety that drove you through your 20s and 30s, the need to prove yourself, to compete, to keep up, starts to fade. You've been running on adrenaline and cortisol for decades and suddenly your body says, you know what? We don't need to do that anymore. You start craving depth over speed, quality over quantity, meaning over excitement. You become less interested in impressing people and more interested in connecting with them. Less interested in having experiences and more interested in understanding experiences. This is what Jung meant when he said life begins at 40. It's not that nothing important happened before, it's that everything that happened before was preparation for this phase. You needed those first 40 years to develop your ego, to learn the rules of the game, to build your foundation. But now you're ready for the real construction project, building a life that's authentically yours. The individuation process is like archaeological work, but instead of digging up ancient artifacts, you're excavating your authentic self from under layers of conditioning, expectations, and adaptive behaviors. You start asking questions like, what do I actually enjoy separate from what I think I should enjoy? What are my real values, not the values I inherited from my family or culture? What kind of work would I do if I didn't need the money? Who would I be if I wasn't afraid of what people think? What parts of myself have I been hiding or suppressing? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're practical ones. Because of 40, you start realizing that you probably have about 40 more years left on this planet, and the question becomes, how do you want to spend them? You also start experiencing what Jung called the return of the repressed. All those parts of yourself that you had to suppress or ignore in order to be successful in the first half of life start demanding attention. The artist you were before you became an accountant. The adventurer you were before you became responsible. The idealist you were before you became practical. This can be uncomfortable because these suppressed parts of yourself often seem incompatible with the life you've built. How can you be a responsible parent and pursue your dream of being a musician? How can you maintain your career and explore your interest in spirituality? How can you be a reliable partner and follow your desire for adventure? But this is exactly the work of individuation, learning to integrate all parts of yourself instead of choosing one aspect and suppressing the rest. It's not about throwing your life away and starting over. It's about expanding your life to include more of who you really are. Jung observed that people who successfully navigate this transition become more whole, more creative, more resilient, and paradoxically, more useful to the world. They stop trying to be everything to everyone and start being authentically themselves to the people who matter. They stop competing in games they don't care about winning and start playing games that align with their values and interests. This is why so many people make dramatic career changes in their 40s and 50s. It's why some people end marriages that looked perfect on paper but felt empty in reality. It's why others start new relationships that seem surprising to everyone who knows them. It's why some people move to different countries, start new businesses, or pursue interests they haven't touched since college. It's not recklessness or a midlife crisis, it's the natural result of finally having enough self-knowledge and life experience to make decisions based on who you really are instead of who you think you should be. The awakening that happens at 40 is essentially your psyche saying, okay, you've learned how to survive and succeed according to external standards. Now let's learn how to thrive according to your internal compass. And that's when life really begins to get interesting. Now comes the hardest part and also the most liberating part, taking off the mask you've been wearing for decades and showing the world who you really are. And I'm not talking about some dramatic personality overhaul or suddenly becoming someone completely different. I'm talking about finally allowing yourself to be someone you've always been but never had permission to express fully. Jung used the term persona to describe the social mask we all wear, the version of ourselves we present to the world to fit in, succeed, and avoid rejection. And let me be clear, developing a persona isn't wrong. It's actually necessary for functioning in society. The problem comes when we forget that it's a mask, when we start believing that the persona is who we are. Think about the masks you've worn throughout your life. The good student mask that helped you get through school. The team player mask that helped you advance in your career. The perfect parent mask that helped you feel competent. The agreeable friend mask that helped you avoid conflict. The strong person mask that helped others rely on you. These masks served important purposes. They helped you navigate complex social situations, build relationships, and achieve goals. But they also required you to hide or suppress parts of yourself that didn't fit the image you were trying to maintain. Maybe you're naturally introverted, but you learned to act extroverted because that's what was rewarded in your workplace. Maybe you're deeply creative, but you learned to focus on practical matters because that's what felt safe. Maybe you're incredibly sensitive, but you learned to act tough because vulnerability felt dangerous. Maybe you're spiritually inclined, but you learned to focus on material success because that's what was valued in your environment. The individuation process that begins at 40 involves gradually removing these masks and integrating the parts of yourself you've been hiding. But this isn't as simple as just being yourself, because after decades of mask wearing, you might not even remember who your authentic self is. This is where the real detective work begins. You have to excavate your true preferences, values, interests, and desires from under layers of conditioning and adaptation. And this process can be both exhilarating and terrifying. It's exhilarating because you start rediscovering parts of yourself that you haven't accessed in years or even decades. You remember that you used to love painting before someone told you it wasn't practical. You remember that you used to be funny before you decided you needed to be serious all the time. You remember that you used to love deep conversations before you learned to make small talk. But it's also terrifying because showing your authentic self to the world involves risk. What if people don't like the real you as much as they like the masked version? What if your authentic desires conflict with your current responsibilities? What if pursuing your true interests means disappointing people who depend on you to stay the same? This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes crucial. The shadow consists of all the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, suppressed, or denied. These aren't necessarily bad parts, they're just parts that didn't fit with the image we were trying to maintain or the life we were trying to build. For example, if you've spent decades being the responsible, practical person in your family, your shadow might contain your spontaneous, adventurous side. If you've always been the strong, independent person, your shadow might contain your vulnerable, dependent side. If you've always been the agreeable, accommodating person, your shadow might contain your assertive, boundary-setting side. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean acting out these suppressed aspects in destructive ways. It means acknowledging them, understanding them, and finding healthy ways to express them in your life. It means becoming a more complete, complex, interesting human being instead of a one-dimensional character playing a single role. This integration process requires what I call courageous authenticity. It means having the courage to disappoint some people in order to finally be honest with yourself and others. It means having difficult conversations about what you actually want instead of just going along with what everyone else wants. It means setting boundaries you've never set before and saying no to things you've always said yes to. One of the most profound shifts that happens during this process is learning to say no without guilt. For the first 40 years of your life, you probably said yes to most requests because you wanted to be helpful, liked, accepted, or successful. But at 40, you start realizing that every yes to something that doesn't align with your authentic self is a no to something that does. You start understanding that saying no to the wrong things creates space for saying yes to the right things. You start realizing that disappointing some people is inevitable if you want to stop disappointing yourself. You start seeing that trying to be everything to everyone results in being nothing to yourself. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate. It means becoming honest about your limitations, clear about your priorities, and authentic about your needs and desires. It means showing up as your real self in your relationships instead of the version of yourself you think people want to see. And here's what's amazing. When you start showing up authentically, you give other people permission to do the same. Your relationships become deeper, more real, more satisfying. You attract people who are drawn to your authentic self rather than your persona. You repel people who were only interested in what you could do for them or how you could make them feel better about themselves. The process of removing the mask and embracing your true self is ongoing. It's not something you complete and then move on from. But the rewards are immediate and profound. You start feeling more energized because you're not constantly performing or pretending. You start feeling more confident because you're operating from your authentic strengths rather than trying to be someone you're not. You start feeling more peaceful because you're no longer at war with yourself. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming the unique individual you were always meant to be, rather than a copy of what someone else thought you should be. And this process of becoming your authentic self? That's when life really begins to feel like your life instead of someone else's life that you happen to be living. Here's what nobody tells you about life after 40. It's not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. All those years you thought were your real life? Those were just the prologue. The main story starts now. Once you stop living for the approval of others and start living from the truth of who you are, something magical happens. You discover a level of freedom you never knew existed. Not the reckless freedom of youth where you have no responsibilities and infinite possibilities. This is something deeper, the freedom that comes from finally knowing who you are and having the courage to be that person in the world. Think about the difference between a 25-year-old's freedom and a 45-year-old's freedom. At 25, you're free because you haven't made many commitments yet. Your life is wide open, but it's also uncertain and anxiety-provoking. You're constantly wondering if you're making the right choices, if you're on the right path, if you're going to be okay. At 45, assuming you've done the work of individuation, you're free because you know who you are and what matters to you. You've made commitments, but they're conscious commitments based on your authentic values rather than unconscious commitments based on what you thought you should do. You've accepted responsibility for your life, but you've also released responsibility for everyone else's expectations of your life. This is when you start experiencing what I call effortless authenticity. Instead of constantly monitoring yourself to make sure you're saying and doing the right things, you start operating from your natural instincts and authentic responses. Conversations become easier because you're not trying to manage other people's impressions of you. Decisions become clearer because you're consulting your internal compass instead of trying to figure out what other people want you to do. Your relationship with time changes dramatically too. In your 20s and 30s, you probably felt like you were racing against some invisible clock, trying to achieve certain milestones by certain ages. Get the degree by 22, get the job by 25, get married by 30, have kids by 35, get the promotion by 40. You were always focused on the next thing, the next achievement, the next level. But at 40, having hopefully achieved some of those milestones and realized they didn't transform your life the way you expected, you start relating to time differently. You become more present-focused. You start paying attention to the quality of your daily experiences instead of just trying to accumulate achievements and possessions. You realize that life isn't a dress rehearsal, this is it. This is your one shot at being alive on this planet. And that realization, instead of creating pressure, actually creates profound relief. You stop saving your energy for someday and start using it today. You stop postponing joy until you've checked all the boxes and start finding joy in the process of living itself. This shift in time perspective also changes your relationship with failure and risk. In your 20s and 30s, failure felt catastrophic because you thought it would ruin your entire future. But at 40, having survived various failures and setbacks, you realize that failure is just information. It's feedback about what works and what doesn't, what fits and what doesn't, what you want and what you don't want. This makes you more willing to take authentic risks, not reckless risks, but calculated risks based on what you genuinely want to explore or achieve. You might finally write that book you've been thinking about for years. You might start that business you've been dreaming about. You might travel to places you've always wanted to see. You might pursue relationships that feel genuine instead of settling for relationships that feel safe. Your relationship with other people transforms too. In the first half of life, relationships often serve instrumental purposes. You network to advance your career. You socialize to fit in. You date to find security. You maintain friendships out of habit or obligation. But after 40, having done the work of individuating, you start choosing relationships based on authentic connection and mutual growth. You become less interested in impressing people and more interested in understanding them. Less interested in being liked by everyone and more interested in being loved by the right people. Less interested in expanding your social circle and more interested in deepening your meaningful connections. You also become much better at detecting authenticity in others. Having done the work of removing your own masks, you develop a sixth sense for when other people are performing versus when they're being genuine. You're drawn to people who are on their own journey of self-discovery and growth, and you naturally drift away from people who are still completely identified with their personas. This doesn't mean you become judgmental or exclusive, it means you become discerning. You realize that your time and energy are finite resources and you want to invest them in relationships that are mutually nourishing rather than draining or superficial. Perhaps most importantly, you develop what Jung called generativity, the desire to contribute to the well-being of future generations and the larger world. But this generativity comes from abundance rather than obligation. Instead of helping others because you think you should, you help others because you want to share what you've learned and because contributing to something larger than yourself gives your life meaning. This might manifest as mentoring younger people in your field. It might involve volunteering for causes you care about. It might mean creating art, writing, or other forms of expression that contribute beauty or insight to the world. It might involve starting a business that solves problems you care about or changing careers to do work that feels more aligned with your values. The key difference is that these contributions come from your authentic self rather than your conditioned self. You're not trying to save the world to prove your worth, you're contributing to the world because you've found your worth and want to share it. This is what Jung meant when he said life begins at 40. Not that nothing important happens before then, but that everything before then is preparation for this phase of authentic living, conscious choosing, and meaningful contributing. The first 40 years teach you how to survive and succeed in the world. The next 40 years teach you how to thrive and serve in the world. And the beautiful thing is, this second phase just keeps getting better. Instead of declining with age, you're actually ascending to higher levels of wisdom, authenticity, creativity, and fulfillment. You're not just getting older, you're getting better at being human. So here we are at the end of our journey through Carl Jung's revolutionary insight about life beginning at 40. But really, this isn't an ending at all, it's a beginning. It's an invitation to see your life from a completely different perspective and to step into the most authentic, fulfilling phase of your existence. Let's recap what we've discovered together. The first 40 years of your life aren't wasted time, they're essential preparation. They're boot camp for your soul. During those decades, you learn the rules of the game, develop the skills you need to function in the world, and accumulate the experiences that will eventually become wisdom. You try on different roles, explore different paths, and yes, you make mistakes. Lots of them. But every experience, every relationship, every success, and every failure is teaching you something crucial about who you are and who you're not. You're gathering the raw materials that you'll eventually use to construct your authentic life. You're like an artist collecting colors on a palette, not yet sure what the final painting will look like, but trusting that each color has its purpose. Around 40, you finally have enough colors to start painting your masterpiece. You've lived long enough to know what energizes you and what drains you. You've experienced enough relationships to know what kind of connection you're seeking. You've achieved enough goals to know which achievements actually matter to you and which ones were just things you thought you should want. This accumulated self-knowledge creates the foundation for individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming your authentic self. And this process, while sometimes challenging, is also the most liberating thing you'll ever do. It's like taking off shoes that never quite fit and finally walking barefoot on the earth. When you stop living for the approval of others and start living from the truth of who you are, everything changes. Your energy increases because you're no longer wasting it on pretending to be someone you're not. Your confidence grows because you're operating from your natural strengths rather than trying to compensate for imaginary weaknesses. Your relationships deepen because you're showing up as your real self instead of a carefully crafted persona. You also develop what I call time sovereignty, the ability to make conscious choices about how you spend your precious hours and days. Instead of being driven by other people's agendas, societal expectations, or unconscious patterns, you start making decisions based on your authentic values and desires. This doesn't mean you become selfish or irresponsible. If anything, you become more responsible, but responsible to your true self and your genuine commitments rather than to external pressures and inherited obligations. You learn to distinguish between what you're actually responsible for and what you've been taking responsibility for out of habit, guilt, or fear. And here's the beautiful paradox: when you finally start living for yourself, you become more useful to others. When you're operating from authenticity rather than obligation, from abundance rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion, you have so much more to offer the world. You stop trying to save everyone and start inspiring people by example. You stop giving advice you don't follow and start sharing wisdom you've actually earned. You stop performing goodness and start embodying it naturally. Now, I want to be realistic with you. This process of individuation isn't always easy or smooth. There will be moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. There will be people who prefer the old version of you and who resist your authentic expression. There will be times when living authentically feels riskier than living according to expectations. But here's what I want you to remember: the biggest risk isn't authenticity, it's continuing to live an inauthentic life. The biggest tragedy isn't that some people might not understand your choices, it's that you might never make choices that feel genuinely yours. The biggest fear shouldn't be disappointing others, it should be disappointing yourself by never discovering who you really are. Carl Jung understood something that our youth-obsessed culture has forgotten. Human beings are designed to keep growing, evolving, and becoming more themselves throughout their entire lives. We're not meant to peak at 25 and then decline. We're meant to use the first half of our lives as preparation for the real adventure of authentic living in the second half. So whether you're 25 and getting a head start on this process, 40 and right in the thick of it, or 60 and thinking it's too late, I want you to know, it's never too early and it's never too late to start living authentically. Every day you choose to be more honest with yourself and others is a day you're truly alive. Every moment you choose authenticity over approval is a moment you're honoring the unique person you came here to be. Your authentic self isn't waiting for perfect conditions to emerge. It's not waiting for permission from others or for all your fears to disappear. It's waiting for you to stop hiding it and start expressing it. It's waiting for you to trust that who you really are is not just enough, it's exactly what the world needs. Life begins at 40 not because nothing important happens before then, but because 40 is when you finally have enough self-knowledge, life experience, and courage to start living as your true self rather than as someone else's idea of who you should be. The question isn't whether you're ready to embrace this truth. The question is, how much longer are you willing to wait to start living your real life? Because that life, the one you were always meant to live, is waiting for you right now. And it's going to be absolutely extraordinary. Jung was right. Life begins at 40. And yours is about to get started.